This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 7, Vietnam, with the section The War's Unpopularity. Nixon promises to end the war, but the war just does not end that quickly. That the North Vietnamese are playing for time at the peace talks, and meanwhile American troops continue to be sent to Vietnam and continue to fight and continue to be killed on very large numbers. By 1970, over 40,000 Americans had been killed and 250,000 had been wounded. The American people had given up on victory. People were asking, what is the point of this war? Why doesn't Nixon just bring the troops home now? College campuses teemed with anti-war demonstrations. The country in 1970, in a lot of ways, seemed to be kind of falling apart at the seams. Even the draft army was breaking apart in places. The first problem was that the law exempted most college students and men with critical skills, which left the fighting up to men from the lower rungs of America's social ladder. That in general, if you were wealthy enough to afford college, then you would skip off to college and leave the fighting to everybody else. This is in contrast, to World War I and World War II, where, the colleges emptied of men volunteering to fight. And professional athletes and singers and movie stars, volunteered to fight. That it was just, it was an entirely different ballgame. Especially in the early years of the war, black Americans were overrepresented in the army and in the casualty lists, but that evened out over time. That there's a very popular myth out there, you can Google it if you want, that many more black soldiers died in Vietnam than their percentage of the population. That's not true. But that did not mean that the war was pleasant by any stretch, regardless of race. The jungles of Vietnam and the rice paddies and the Viet Cong and the constant not knowing who was a friend and who was a foe made the fighting in Vietnam unpleasant at best. America back home was exploding with a new drug culture, and that drug culture expanded to the army. Marijuana was prevalent, and harder drugs were easily available as well. Sabotage and mutiny were not unheard of. People would, break their equipment so they wouldn't have to go out on patrol. People would ignore officers, especially young officers right out of West Point, who hadn't earned their troops, trust or respect. And rumors even started coming home that some officers were being fragged or killed by their own men on purpose, shot in the back or killed with fragmentation grenades. And this was not an unpopular sentiment that you could see by the anti-war poster. These Americans support their troops when they shoot their own officers. Be that as it may, and these things were real and these things happened, it is important to remember that the vast majority of Americans who went to Vietnam, that the vast majority of Americans who served in Vietnam, despite the fact that, discipline sometimes did break down, the vast majority of Americans who served in that war served with distinction, did their duty, and many of them served with honor. And that's important to remember. The American people turned further against the war. In 1970, news came out of an incident from 1968 where an American patrol led by Lieutenant Calley, and there's Lieutenant Calley, had massacred a group of unarmed Vietnamese civilians who lived in a village that was hiding Viet Cong. That the village, there was Viet Cong hiding in the village. Then the circumstances are a little hazy, but Lieutenant Calley, who was serving, he served in Vietnam a long time, just kind of snapped. And because the village would not turn over the Viet Cong that they were hiding, Lieutenant Calley ordered his troops to fire on the unarmed villagers, and about a dozen of them were killed instantly, and many died from their wounds thereafter. The Army tried to cover the incident up, but eventually it was leaked to the press. The men responsible were court-martialed. No one served serious jail time. But what it served to do is it served to make the American soldier look like the aggressor. It served to make the American soldier look like a monster. It made true the anti-war demonstrators, name-calling. They called the soldiers baby killers. This one isolated incident, painted with a broad brush the entire American effort in Vietnam. Furthermore, even angering the American population, was the fact that Richard Nixon invaded Cambodia in 1970. The Viet Cong, as you know, they were not a regular army. That the white section here on the map is Vietnam, but the Viet Cong, were always operating in Cambodia and around Cambodia, and especially kind of using Cambodia as a refuge for their fighters to resupply, to re-equip. That the Americans would chase the Viet Cong out of Vietnam into Cambodia, where American troops could not go because it would violate Cambodian sovereignty. So Richard Nixon, always in the back of his mind is we need to get the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table. So he invades Cambodia, going after Viet Cong's sanctuaries. Militarily speaking, it's a necessary move. That you can't just let the enemy go and leave him to resupply and restock up in peace. But Nixon does it in an anti-war atmosphere when the public is sick of the war, and furthermore, he doesn't even bother to consult Congress. That he just orders the army to invade this neutral country, technically neutral country, without asking Congress. This leaks out. Angry students nationwide kicked off a series of protests and demonstrations larger than any had yet been seen. That the this is Kent State. We're not quite there yet. The anger in the country was palpable. Homegrown radicals used these demonstrations to attack police, destroy property, commit arson. There was a lot of destruction. There was a lot of mayhem. That mixing in, with just people who wanted an end to the war are hardcore leftists who want a revolution in America. They want a race war. They want revolution. They want to kill the capitalist pigs. All the other fun, 60s radicals type things. At Kent State, a small university in Ohio, things got so bad that the governor called out the National Guard to protect the university. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Nixon's invasion of Cambodia only lasts 2 months, but the fact of it remained that he did not ask Congress. It leaked out. The students across America and the anti-war people went bonkers. Congress, when learning about this, sought to restrain the president's power. The Senate moved to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And you remember that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave President Johnson back in 1964 the authority to conduct a war, and Johnson said that it covers everything. It was like grandma's nightgown. Congress attempts to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, but it cannot pass both houses, so Richard Nixon keeps using its authority for his conduct in the Vietnam War. Back to Kent State. At Kent State in April of 1970, the National Guard is called out to protect the campus of Kent State University from anti-war demonstrators. The anti-war demonstrators have been kind of destroying property and creating mayhem in town and around the university for 3 days. The National Guard shows up. They are facing a hostile crowd. People are yelling insults back and forth. The soldiers march. They seem to get lost. They turn around. And then, for reasons that are sort of unclear, the National Guard aimed their weapons and fired into the crowd. Their bullets killed 4 college students and wounded several more. It was an unspeakable tragedy. Both that, it was nothing that the National Guard was proud of. Most even-keeled anti-war people were not proud of this. Kind of the extreme anti-war crowd said, well, of course, that's what American troops do. They kill children. The Doves blamed the troops. The Hawks blamed the activists. Modern Americans looked at the situation and simply could not believe that this was happening in the United States, that this was not the country that they had grown up in. In order to kind of mollify the nation's youth, that, for a long time, Americans many anti-war activists have been saying that you could go off to war at age 18, that the draft started, you could be drafted at 18, but you couldn't vote until you were 21, and that seemed to be unfair. The youth in America in the 1960s and early 70s constantly seemed to be on the edge of rebellion, either, moral rebellion against authority or actual revolution and violence against the United States government. The United States attempted to mollify the youth of the country by ratifying the 26th Amendment, which made the voting age 18. Before 1971, the voting age was 21. The reasoning was kind of clear, that if you could be sent off to Vietnam, the least you could do was vote for it or not. To further mollify America's youth, fewer men were drafted. The window where you could be drafted was shortened. That Nixon is trying to wind up the war as fast as he can and still maintain that military pressure on the North Vietnamese. More fuel, though, is added to the fire in 1971 by the publication of what's known as the Pentagon Papers. President Nixon learns that these papers have been leaked to the press. He begs the New York Times, and the New York Times has them. Nixon begs the New York Times not to publish these papers, that they're going to make the United States look terrible, they're going to cost American lives, they're going to make Presidents Kennedy and Johnson look bad, and him. But the New York Times published anyway. And they published hundreds of classified documents that showed that the administrations of Kennedy and the administration of Johnson had miscalculated badly in the early stages of the war. They had screwed up badly in the early stages of the war, and then because they had screwed up, because they had miscalculated, they went and lied to the American people that what the president said on television did not bear really much relation to official reports that he was getting from the United States military. Nixon, the United States government sues the New York Times to get them to stop the publication of these papers. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Quickly, the Supreme Court ruled in a matter of days that the New York Times did have the right to publish these materials. The Times published the rest of them, and the Pentagon Papers were out there. The publishing of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 it showed two things. First, Nixon's relationship with the press, never good to begin with, was now totally sour. Nixon did not trust the press. The press hated Nixon. Nixon responded by hating the press, and the feeling was very mutual on both sides. And second, kind of more important in a long-term way, it showed that Kennedy's administration and Johnson's administration had simply not ever been truthful with the American people about the goals of the war in Vietnam, the costs of the war, the origins of the war. And this caused a more significant trust deficit than ever before. That trust in the American government reached an all-time low. That, in the span of, a year and a half, you have, the allegations at My Lai, the My Lai massacre, you have the Pentagon Papers, you have Kent State, you have the invasion of Cambodia, all of these things working to turn Americans more and more against the war, many Americans more and more against Richard Nixon, and now the sense is, Richard Nixon, that the American government is desperately trying to find a political way out of this mess before, the country really falls apart at the seams, because in a lot of places and a lot of times, and to a lot of people watching the news on television, it did seem that the United States was breaking apart.